I know how this goes, but I also know I'm not really that good at it.
Well, it takes a lot of practice.
Hi, everybody. This is Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick, and you're in the company of fellow gearheads around the world, listening from places like Queens, New York, Caledonia, Michigan, San Mateo, California, Whistler, British Columbia, Canada, Tenerife, Spain, and Cambridgeshire, England. Happy New Year to all of you. And as you know, the show's been on a holiday break, and I was planning to take another week off, but frankly, I couldn't stay away. So here we are kicking off 2025 by nerding out on a subject that interests me to no end, namely auto restoration. I've done plenty of work on old cars myself, and I can usually muddle through a job, although I do screw it up from time to time. But you know, to fully restore a car is a daunting task, even if you do it poorly. And doing it properly is part art, part science, and a truly authentic restoration is the kind of thing that, well, you know it when you see it. That's all I can say. It's so much better than shiny paint and an engine rebuild. And my guest today lives and breathes this kind of stuff, and he's exactly the kind of guy you'd like to have on the job. Forrest Davis is the shop foreman of GRIOT'S Motors in Tacoma, Washington. And you might remember I had their founder, Philip Griot, on the show last spring. That was episode 113, if you want to scroll back and check it out. But Forrest and I got kind of deep in the weeds on this one about what they do and how they do it at GRIOT'S. And I think you'll be impressed by his thoughts on the subject, as well as some of the projects that customers have entrusted to GRIOT'S Motors. Now, if you enjoy Horsepower Heritage, go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage and support the show with a donation. And some of you decided to make it a very Merry Christmas, and I truly appreciate it. And you know who you are, so thank you. Again, that's buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage. Link in the show notes if you want to donate. And one more housekeeping note before I get started. If you'd like to sponsor the podcast, let's talk. And I'm talking about your business, your venture. Let's see if we can find a fit. Go to my website, horsepowerheritage.com. Click on the contact button. It's at the top right of the page. And drop me a line. All right, that's it for the housekeeping. Without further ado, here's my interview with Forrest Davis of GRIOT'S Motors. Enjoy.
So what's on the shop floor right now, Forrest?
Oh man, we've got quite the variety of different cars that we're working on currently. We have a Fox Body Mustang, an 89 Fox Body Mustang that's currently in the fab shop getting some really cool modifications done to it. We have a Dino Ferrari, a 74 246 Dino in a very rare, cool color that is receiving a thorough mechanical restoration. We have a Jeep Honcho, a 79 Jeep Honcho that is getting kind of a patina restoration project. We have a 63 Corvette, a 68 Corvette, Lancia Stratos. We just received a 75 Tyrrell 007 Formula One car that has kind of an interesting history. We have an F40. We have an Aston Martin DB9, a 3.0 CSI. I might need to go look at my whiteboard to make sure I'm covering everything, but it's quite the variety of different cars that we're currently working on.
Yeah, it is. And I'm interested to find out, like, I want to go into the inner workings of GRIOT'S Motors today, because, you know, you walk into a typical restoration shop or a business that services classic cars, and more often than not, there are parts scattered everywhere. There's tools strewn about. It's often a mess. And But you guys are kind of surgical, I've noticed. You guys keep everything neat and tidy, and that's always a good sign.
Yeah, and there's a lot of thought put into that. When we built this facility, me and Philip Griot, we were very intentional about how we laid the facility out. And we had learned some difficult lessons from just operating in a back room at GRIOT'S garage. And one of the biggest lessons was you have to have adequate storage for tools, parts. If you're taking 10 different cars apart, you have tens of thousands of different pieces from each one that need to go somewhere and need to be efficient we need to be efficient in the way that we retrieve them, process them. So it's very intentional. And really what it comes down to is kind of like a core message that we want to subliminally give to the customer when they walk in the door. And the message is the work that we perform in this space is reflective of the space, or vice versa. And so we want that initial impact of what the customer sees in the space to reflect like the authenticity, and then also just like the premium level of the work that they're being provided.
And customers can come to you with all sorts of different needs, right? So for example, a guy might come in and say, I want a mechanical restoration, but leave the rest. But you can go all the way to a nut and bolt, body off rotisserie job, right?
Absolutely. And really, if I had it my way, I would choose those projects every single time. And it's not that I don't want to do work for everyone. It's more that when we do everything, we are really controlling the timeline, the caliber and quality of the product that we're putting out into the world, and the experience that customer is going to get when the car is done and they drive it for the first time. So those are the projects I gravitate to, but we obviously we handle a lot of different projects. They're all interesting in different ways. And they're all fun to take on for different reasons. But I would say we specialize in those full on every nut and bolt. I know that term is used very widely. Every nut and bolt on a car coming apart, being restored to as new from the factory, or in some cases better, depending on what the customer's needs are. And delivering a experience that matches the caliber of the work that we're putting out there as well.
Often when I'm turning wrenches, I end up with a couple parts left over.
It's not rare.
Right. And most of us shade tree mechanics, that it's just comes with the territory and you figure it out. But that begs the question for you guys, you're pros. Your expectations are high of yourselves, and of course the customer's expectations are high. I'm guessing you try to meet a higher standard than the customer expects, right? Because then they're going to be happy.
Yeah, you have to. And, there's a lot of different types of customers out there. And a big part of my job is, not only managing all of our restoration employees and also all the projects that are ongoing, but it's also communicating with customers, building relationships with high level customers that the goal is to have customers for life that come back to us after a car is finished and want another one done. And so sure, we're always going for the highest caliber of what we're capable of. And different people have different needs, and their levels are different as well. But, we want to put out the highest quality product that we're capable of. And that's always the focus. And that doesn't always work for some customers too. It's something to consider, is we're not for everybody. Not everybody wants, a 100-point car that they're going to take to Pebble Beach, or, like the perfect weekend driver for the summer. Some people, that whether it's budgetary constraints or, the vision for their project, we might not fit perfectly with that, but that's part of our job too, is just building a relationship that works for us and what we're trying to accomplish, but also meets the goals of the customer.
So if I bring you a car and I say, I want a comprehensive restoration, what's your system or process that you've come up with that works for you? I'm really interested to hear like what the steps are involved, because project management is so important. You're working on a timeline. You have multiple jobs in the shop at any given moment. So what does that look like?
Yeah. So it usually just starts with conversation, whether that's a customer reaching out to us via email or a phone call, or even just stopping by. A lot of the times that customer has been referred to us by an existing customer or somebody who's worked with us or somebody who's familiar with GRIOT'S garage or just our own marketing and seeing what we've already accomplished. And then it's just really a conversation about like, this is what we're capable of. This is what we do on a day-to-day basis. Is that within the framework of what you want? And then really locking down a vision for that project, working with the customer, because everybody wants something different. The Mustang Fox body that we're working on is going to be a rowdy, wide tire, modernized, slightly widened fenders, a few like modernized exterior attributes. That's a custom car by all descriptions. And then another customer, like the Dino project, the Dino 246 that we're working on is a very original project. So the questions are often like, is this a show car? Or are you trying to win a concours with it? Is this a car that you just want to drive for the joy of driving? Is it a car that you have a relationship with? Like, was it passed on to you by a family member or a father? Or is this vehicle reconnecting with some aspect of your past? Is a really common one too. Is like maybe this customer had one in high school and they wrecked it, or it's still the same one they had in high school and they just have the means now to make it perfect in their eyes.
Right.
So it's all about discussion with that customer and locking down exactly what they're looking for. And then it's up to us to build out a plan. We have a restoration contract that we put in place that kind of lays out the project with the customer and gives them assurances and us assurances. Basically, we plan out like, this is how it's going to go. We're going to update you throughout the entire process. We have the most transparent invoicing structure that you've ever seen from a workshop. I guarantee it. And you're going to see every little thing that we do. You're welcome here anytime you want to see how the progress is going. And usually we dive in depending on the timeline of the project and the starting point. But that's kind of a general description of where we start.
So let's take the Dino as an example. The Dino rolls in. It's going to be a factory correct restoration. Where do you start?
Inspection. Always inspection. And usually, by the time we've discussed this with a customer, we've maybe already seen the car. Maybe not on a lift, but we always do an arrival inspection. We have a very descriptive process to do these inspections, whether it's for a car that we're consigning and selling for a customer, because we also offer that service, or it's the beginning of a restoration process, or it's when a restoration is completed and it is going to go back to the customer's hand. All these checklists and inspections allow us to assure our product, but we always start with an inspection so we know where we're starting from. So that's going to include a mechanic, a restoration technician is what we call them, going through the car, checking like the common stuff that, you might get at a high caliber mechanic in terms of like the health of the car, the suspension, the brakes, the compression, the fluids, like the basic stuff. But then depending on the car, it becomes a little bit more specialized, especially when we're talking about a vehicle that's going to be restored, because we're talking about authenticity. What is missing? Those are kind of some big questions. Like, is there the original motor? And how does that correlate in terms of like the casting numbers in the block and the transmission? And how does that relate to the chassis code of the vehicle? Are there like emissions things that were taken off? And that's kind of like a very common thing for Dinos, is they had like smog pumps and charcoal canisters, and a lot of that stuff like just gets taken off at some point in the car's life because, you know, is maybe a hindrance to power or simplicity and you don't necessarily need it. But when we're talking about a factory restoration, maybe we want that stuff and now we got to go track it down. It gets added to a parts list. So it goes more in depth depending on the vehicle. And like another big one is like, is the car corroded? Is it rusty? Because when we're talking about restoring a car from A to Z, a big factor on old cars is corrosion and rust, and how much fabrication time is going to be required in our fabrication shop to repair that for the paint shop so we can get the body refinished. Things like that.
I'm guessing that something that I always do is I take photographs before I start disassembly and then during that process, so I know where everything goes. I was just doing that yesterday on the junction box, my wiring junction box on my Ford Model A, because I was trying to track down a possible short in the system.
Sure.
And I found that there was a couple wires that had some insulation that was just crumbled off. You know, the car's 93 years old, so I went ahead and taped those up and put it all back together. But I made sure, even though there's only like 6 wires in that junction box, I want them to go back in the right place. So I imagine that you guys are doing that kind of documentation throughout.
Oh man, and it gets pretty hardcore. The reason for that, and there's kind of a running joke in the shop, because you think you take enough photos, and then maybe in a year or a year and a half, you're starting to put this car back together. And maybe you didn't get that exact angle that you need for putting that thing back together. So we are constantly improving, but we take so many photos. It's not even funny. We take photos of every fastener that comes off of a car. So everything bag and tag is a really common term that goes around in the restoration shop, of like removing parts from a car. Any of the hardware gets bagged and tagged, and it goes with a vehicle, and it goes with like the parts that are associated. You know, you write a description for that part. But we have to take the next level of those fasteners need to be degreased, media blasted, sometimes stripped with acid, sent to our zinc plater. They're going to get thrown in a big vat of zinc plating solution, come back in a not necessarily organized, and put back with the other fasteners that go with that selected unit of whatever it is, fuel pump, and put back together. So we take photos before it leaves, and we put it on like a big 1x1 inch grid, take a vertical photo. So we know the length of that fastener. We know the size of it because we can relate it with the grid. So yeah, it gets pretty hardcore, and we share all that stuff with the customer too. You know, I like to go around and take more aesthetic photos for the customer of like where we're at with the process, because if you send them, 10,000 photos of the disassembly of a motor with Dino, some of the allure might disappear from what we're doing, but it's required for us to do a good job.
No, that's a great system. So I have to tell you, I have a 1953 Land Rover in my garage that's partially disassembled. I'm systematically going through it, and cool. Like right now the project is rebuild the front axle, get it back on its leaf springs so that I have a roller again. But I've bagged and tagged all my fasteners and all those little parts. They've all been in the media blaster. They've all been in the tumbler. I'll do a phosphate coating on a lot of them.
Yep.
I use gun blue sometimes for fasteners.
Yeah, black oxide. Sure.
Exactly. So I know how this goes, but I also know I'm not really that good at it.
Well, it takes a lot of practice,
Yeah, exactly. You got to be doing it every day.
You do. Yeah.
And I kind of subscribe to that whole Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours to become an expert.
Sure.
And incidentally, Malcolm Gladwell is a car guy.
I don't know. Really?
Yeah. He's a car guy. But anyway, so yeah, that's so important. And I'm not surprised at all that that's part of your process, but there's obviously many stages to restore any component.
Yeah.
It has to be inspected. It has to be documented in photographs and dimensions, as you say. And then it goes through physical processes.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
Where do you take it?
So it just depends, on the finish of that part. This is like where the nerdiness of what we do comes into play, because I have an employee handbook that every new employee gets, and it has, descriptions and photographs of, a part in a piece that have different coatings on them, because the most common ones honestly are like a part gets painted black, or sometimes we powder coat stuff. Or it has black oxide, which is like the black kind of dull finish that you see in hardware stores on hardware, or it gets zinc plated, and there's different types of zinc out there. There's silver zinc, that's like your silver shiny fasteners that you see on bolts, or there's zinc with a yellow chromate coating, which is like the goldish yellow fasteners that you see on different cars, very common in especially European vehicles. But there's stuff where you run into a coating that you might not be familiar with. Very common on Ferraris, vintage Ferraris, is a cad plating. So cadmium is the metal that's used, and it has like a very dull silver look as opposed to like a shiny silver look. So it requires research too, like what's the correct way to do this, especially if it's for a car that's being judged in any capacity. And we have cars where we have a bit more leeway in terms of how the car is restored. Like maybe we use stainless in some cases as a replacement.
I'll throw a weird one at you. So I mentioned the Land Rover. Land Rover used a process called Sherardization on many of their fasteners, and it's named after the guy who came up with it. But
interesting.
A Sherardized fastener is one that has been vapor galvanized.
Oh, interesting. Okay, sure.
Yeah,
I'm familiar with the process of like vapor coating different things.
Yeah. So it's a zinc coating, just like you would galvanize any piece of steel, but it's ultra thin because it literally is a
vapor deposition. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Super interesting. I don't know of anyone in the United States who does this. If they do, they're going to want quantity. So I can't just call them up and say, "Hey, can you Sherardize, these 180 fasteners for me," right? Like,
yeah, that can be a really difficult thing, honestly. And I'll tell you, like, if there's one thing that I hold close to my chest in terms of information I give people, it's my zinc plater, because finding good subcontractors for some of these types of processes can be very difficult. Because if you think about like going to Home Depot and buying like fasteners, whoever plated those fasteners is doing like 1 million of them at a time. And we want to call that guy up and be like, "Hey, can you stop making money doing 1 million of these bolts? And can you do like 13 screws for me? I'll pay you." And that's always a challenge, but I've been doing this long enough that I've built some great relationships with subcontractors. First of all, we try and do as much of this process in-house as possible. There are things that I don't want to do in-house, and one of those things is zinc plating. Another is like chrome plating, because you're talking about like a very dedicated facility with some not so friendly chemicals to do some of these processes. So in those cases, we've developed relationships with really good people, and we've had to try many different people until we found the right fit for somebody who just really cares. If you have people that just really care about what you're doing and the caliber of the work that they're putting out, then that's a start of a great relationship for me. They're hard to find.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different things that are much easier farmed out. Obviously plating is a big one, but also like instrument restoration.
Sure. It can be pretty specialized. We've done some instrument stuff, but we've also worked with great companies. A couple of them are down in the LA area for speedometers that do just insane work. We try and do as much in-house as possible because we're trying to expand our capabilities as much as possible. A big part of us expanding into the current space that we have and growing GRIOT'S Motors as a business was having control of the process. And that control gives us oversight of the timeline, the quality, and the customer experience. And that's really important to us. But there'll always be things that we don't do, and we got to get help with those. And that's when those relationships are really important.
Yeah. Now, inevitably, there comes a time when you have to make a decision whether to restore a component or replace it.
Sure.
And what's your trigger point for that typically?
Oh, man, it really depends on the component.
Sure.
We do buy a lot of stuff, and sometimes it's a monetary decision. Like, we could restore this part, but it's going to take 40 hours to do it. If I can go buy one that is equivalent and doesn't deteriorate from the caliber of the car by doing so, then I'm going to save that customer money. And we try and be very intentional about that, because it's also saving us time and we can move on to something else. So sure. Like a really common one on those is like rubber components, like every rubber component on anything, 30 years or older, or maybe even less than that, is probably deteriorated, whether it's deformed or it's dry rotted and cracking. A lot of suspension components, things like that. And sure, a lot of that stuff sometimes you can buy, but when you're trying to find control arm bushings for launch a Stratos, like, good luck.
Yeah.
And in those situations, we have to figure that problem out. In that scenario, we actually machined our own bushings out of urethane for that project. So it just depends on what we're working on and what the end goal of that project is, and making sure we're not deteriorating the quality of the car if it is a Concours restoration project.
Yeah, and you really have to be careful where you source parts, because I'm sure you have found this to be true. The quality of a lot of reproduction parts has plummeted in the last 15 years or so.
Sure.
And also, oftentimes let's say you have a molded plastic part, it might not be quite the same as the original part. There are small details that often have not been replicated.
Absolutely. The instance that stands out in my brain is Porsche 911 dashboards. And this is so like niche. Maybe it's not that niche, but I replaced a dashboard in a car, and it even came from Porsche's classic like parts supplier, or like it came from Porsche. We ordered it from a Porsche dealer, and the fitment of where like the ends of the dashboard line up with the top of the door panels was not the same as the original dashboard.
Wow, that's pretty glaring.
It is, yeah. And I'm not trying to like get on Porsche too much, but there. Another one is like badges for vintage Ferraris. I'm not going to speak about the exact vehicle, but there can be differences because maybe that manufacturer or the company is that's producing these parts, they get it 90%, but maybe that 10% is like what differentiates a perfect car from a car that has been changed in some small way, shape, or form. So yeah, we see a lot of it. And then there's just like trash out there too,
Yes.
There's a lot of trash out there, unfortunately. Like, I am a Volkswagen guy. Like, I've had a Volkswagen Beetle since I was 16, and it's like it's the same car it's my first car. I still have it. And like that market is so saturated with trash parts, unfortunately. There's just like, you could reach for 10 different parts and 9 of them are not going to be good. Like,
no, that is true for so many mass production cars that have now reached a classic status. I mean, British sports cars, good example. Volkswagen, obviously. The list goes on. And anyone who's listening to this and has one of those cars in their garage and is working on them knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's very frustrating.
It is.
It's very frustrating. But by the same token, there was a time when a lot of these parts were considered no longer available. The new old stock supply of parts had dried up. You were at the mercy of finding a used part maybe on eBay or at an auto swap meet. So the growth of the car culture and classic car culture has really contributed to a lot of those parts coming back on the market, even though a lot of times they're not up to the original standard. At least you can get something.
Yeah, something is better than nothing. I mean, to be frank with you, most of the time.
Yeah.
That's a good thing. I have, even talking about Volkswagens, I like, not that that's the only thing that I touch, but, there's been companies recently that have really upped their game, with parts and like even rebuying and starting to move stuff from maybe like Asia in terms of production back into the United States to control quality levels and things like that. So look, there's always going to be issues with parts. We all learn those like hard lessons, and hopefully you can find somebody that you trust, and a company that, will work with you. There's sometimes like you just can't find stuff too. Like one challenge, here's an example of part sourcing issue that we had. One early car that we restored in kind of like the first 2 years of GRIOT'S Motors was a W123 Mercedes, a 300 TD wagon. And it was a really cool project, like, because we were given liberty to make this thing perfect. Everything was done. It got painted a really beautiful midnight blue color, and it had a really nice, Palomino is the name of the color of the interior, but like a light beige leather interior. Everything got leather. It was really cool. We were basically done with this project, but there's one part we couldn't find. And that part was the rear glass for the rear trunk of the wagon, the gasket to install that glass. And the one that we had pulled out of it was dry rotted and not usable. That's not an easy part to go make. It's an extrusion. So it's like a rubber pressed through like a cookie, like a cake frosting die, and like turned into a gasket. And we had to wait like 3 months just for that one part. Because some guy in Germany, makes 10 a year or something like that.
I know exactly that scenario. Yeah. And you better get on his list right now.
Absolutely. So, that was a lesson for us, that everything, I always say everything matters. All the details matter. And something that we've improved upon, that, when we take a car apart, we start ordering parts immediately. Like we have a huge list of, this is the stuff that we need to go find. And, so we can, start getting stuff as early as possible. And that's financially difficult sometimes, because it costs a lot of money to buy all the parts, replacement stuff that you need for a full on restoration. But, at least you don't run into those timeline issues when you get to the end.
No, that's a good point. This gasket that you're talking about reminded me, I was doing a pickup cab top on a series Land Rover,
sure,
like 15 years ago, right? And they have corner windows on the pickup cab. The Land Rover parts suppliers had a gasket that was not really that pliable, really hard to work with. You risk breaking that glass just in the installation. And even with a good gasket, that's always a risk, right? But someone suggested, well, what about the gaskets for the early 50s Chevrolet pickups and GMC pickups? And you know what? That gasket worked like a charm. It went in like butter.
Yeah, cool.
So it's sometimes those crossovers or those analogs can really save the day, especially if it's not like a factory perfect restoration.
Yeah, for sure. We have an ongoing joke in the shop that we're doing arts and crafts. Because sometimes we are doing arts and crafts where one example of something that we had to screen print recently was the air filter box for the Launch Stratos that we're working on. So we actually had to create a digital file using Adobe products and create a screen painting screen in-house and screen print the logo on top of the air box. And, it's those details that separate you from the rest of just taking that time. But that's the arts and crafts. You have to figure out these problems sometimes. And sure, there might be a specialist out there that can help us. And sometimes we would take that option. But if we can do that in-house and have the capability next time, that's pretty cool as well. And just expanding our opportunity. But yeah, not everything, like in your example, like the quarter window, like sometimes you might buy a part from Porsche and it's literally just like a flat sheet of rubber. And you can buy a flat sheet of rubber somewhere else.
Right. Yeah.
That just depends on the caliber.
Of course, oftentimes, you need that all important OEM logo on the part.
Yeah. And a lot of the times that's really important. That's definitely comes into play for a lot of projects. It's got to say the right thing. It's got to look the right way. Other projects you have more liberty with, but yeah, we have to balance that and balance it with the customer's expectations.
We're kind of nerding out on this episode, which is fine because I think my listeners enjoy that. But another like piece of minutia that is so important is the finishes on a given component. Like there could be like 8 different shades and sheens of black under the hood of a car.
Totally.
Or on the chassis. And getting that right, that authenticity, it really separates a high caliber restoration from the rest of the pack.
Yeah. The paint department is such a, it's like a science. It's also an art and has such a huge effect to have somebody with vast experience in that department, because it is hard, like to get stuff like that right, because, you're talking about the sheen level of an engine bay, right? And just details about that, like you could spray something and do a spray out to verify like this is what I want, but then you could change the paint booth temperature by 10 degrees and it's going to change it. So like there's all these variables that you have to take into account, and you really have to like dial that stuff in. So that's something we deal with all the time. Like we have to try really hard to control as much as we can in that space, whether it's sheen level, whether it's like the right color and making sure the color is perfect and doing like 30 different spray outs, changing the color to make it perfect. Because we have a computer system and we have all these toners that you mix together and make any color, but the computer system's not always right. And sometimes you have to correct that. And that's where the art comes in.
That's why it's so important to be able to determine the original finish on something. And that goes for the exterior paint too, right? If a car's been repainted 5 times, you're like, during the disassembly process, you're looking for that nice big patch of unbroken original paint, right? So you can replicate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes that'll be hiding in unique places. Maybe it's under a cowl or
headlight bucket,
wherever, somewhere that hasn't seen the light of day as much of other parts and pieces.
Yeah.
We even, like for Ferrari did these really cool, pamphlets that are really hard to come by now, but that had like actual little pieces of the paint sprayed out. So if you're looking for like a perfect restoration on a Ferrari, like you would definitely want to reference that, because the computer might say, this is the color, this is correct. But everything in that paint, the chemically has changed in the last 40, 50 years. Like the toners are different. The metallics are different. They're being manufactured in a different way. The chemical composition has been changed to be more compliant in, California and other states. A lot has changed. And so that color that the computer says might be right, might not quite be right. And if that's really important to you, then you have to take that into account. Sometimes it's not important. Sometimes those changes can make really cool things happen. Like, waterborne paints are really prevalent now. That's something that we use. Most of the paint that we spray is waterborne here. It allows metallics to shine in like a completely different way. It really can accentuate different cars and different lighting. Just having that ability to be like, literally the chemical has water in it and it allows the little flakes of the metallic to stand differently than maybe they would have 30 years ago. So it just depends on what you want. If you want it to be 100% original, then you might have to make quite a few changes. But if, like it's a custom car and you want it to pop, then some of the modern products can really make it look good too.
You mentioned the paint chips, the original paint chips. I have a 1967 BMW dealer brochure.
Cool.
It happened to be for the 1600.
Sure.
And it's got authentic 1x1 paint chips of every color available.
Super cool.
It's the real paint that they use on the cars. And it hasn't deteriorated at all.
Isn't that wild? Yeah.
It's incredible, and to see them on that brochure, it really brings the color to life, because you can get that wrong so easily, and I see it all the time. I'll see 2 cars of the same make and model next to each other at a show. They're the same color, but they're not, and it can be very subtle. Speaking of which, do you guys still do single stage paint jobs? Because a lot of these old cars do not look right with a 2-stage.
Yeah, we can use whatever product. If the customer specifies it, we can, as long as we can get the product, we can use whatever. So yeah, we have the ability. We have sprayed single stage. We've done base clear coat. We've been solvent base coat, which, it's solvent, or you've got waterborne base coat, which is water is the delivery method. We have 10 different clear coats depending on what you want. Yeah. So there's a lot of variability when it comes down to authenticity. What I would say is, like, most of the time the customer just wants it to look really good, Sure. Sure, sometimes like the exactness of what it should be is the preeminent, like goalpost of the project. I would say the majority, and maybe it's changing over time too, is like just people's tastes change and what they want to do with their cars. I would say like the majority of them, like they just want it to look the best that it can. But yeah, we have the ability to do all those things.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, you have to, right? It's the difference between getting the job and not sometimes, I'm sure.
For sure. Yeah. So. Yeah, absolutely. And we built our paint facility in a way that, like, sure, you can have the nicest equipment, but you still have to have the most skilled labor, especially for the paint department. And we actually hired a guy recently that, owned his own shop for 30 plus years and was known as the best painter in the Pacific Northwest region. And I was able to coax him to, shutting down his business. Part of that is like he was maybe a little tired of doing the business ownership aspects of that and coming to work with us, which is pretty cool. And he's a great person to have around for his expertise, for his personality, and, what he brings to the table. But, he operated it with a $7,000 paint booth that he bought, 30 plus years ago and was putting out the best paint jobs around. Our paint booth was a lot more than $7,000, but, we wanted the facility to have the highest capabilities possible. So we have a full downdraft paint booth, a full downdraft prep deck, which is where you do all the dirty sanding and filler work and priming and things like that. So we've got a couple painters. He's one of them. And we've got the right facilities to do the best job possible and the right people too. So it's a balance between the two,
Right. Incidentally, how do you guys bring a part down to bare surface? Like, do you use vapor blasting? Do you use a media blaster? I mean, there's different applications, right? And
absolutely, we have a media blaster on site. We use it all the time. If a piece is being painted, that's like a smaller piece, maybe like a suspension component, steering link, something like that, we would absolutely blast it, and then we epoxy paint it using epoxy base primer, and then we have a few different products that we use depending on what sheen level we want. So yeah, we have a media blaster. If we're talking about the whole an entire chassis, we do different things depending on the project. So we've had cars acid dipped, where they actually take a whole body of a car and they, put it in a giant tub of nasty chemicals, and it eats all the paint and hopefully all the other coatings off of the bare shell as well. That has upsides and downsides. The upside is you really see what you're working with, your starting point. The downside is if you're not complete, let's say you've got like a space frame car or a car that's just stamped sheet metal. If you're not pulling everything apart, like let's say the rockers might have a cavity in there. If you weren't planning on pulling the outer rocker panel off, like it's stripped inside there too. There's no finish left in there, and you really need to be cautious that everything has some type of rust prevention on that. So that's kind of a downside to that type of process. And then in other cases, we might have the bottom and the inside of the car, the engine bay, like the less sensitive areas, media blasted. And I don't like to say sandblast because they don't typically use sand. Sand is like really aggressive. I call it media blast, and they use a lot of different materials depending on the job. But we'll probably, like most cars, now we are media blasting the bottoms of the engine bays and the interior, and then the exterior of the car we will mechanically strip with sandpaper. And the reason we do that is if you sandblast or media blast the exterior of a car and you have all these thin body panels, it will actually warp the exterior. So there's heat created and distortion created by blasting the outside body panels or anything that's not, super rigid. And then when the body guys go to do body work, like the thing's wavy as all get out down the side of it or the roof or whatever. So we've learned lessons, and we've attuned our methods and processes to give us the best result in the safest way possible.
By the way, there's a guy on Instagram who his whole Instagram page is acid dipping car bodies.
Oh yeah, I've seen him. Yeah, he put like figurines in the acid bath sometimes, like a Joker.
Yes. Yes. It's so fun to look at that. I mean, you can totally doom scroll his page for an hour and just, I enjoy that.
It taps into that ASMR like thing in a human brain that's like, wow, that's so satisfying to watch, like all the paint just wrinkle off the outside of a car.
Yeah. And then this is a little tangential, but it's worth a look at YouTube for guys who restore old toys like Tonka trucks and stuff.
Sure.
Because it's full disassembly, cleaning, repainting, everything. And they are right down to the water transfer decals.
Yep.
And it's really fun to watch.
Look, it all comes from like the same place.
It totally does. It totally does.
I was the kid that was taking apart my like old CD players and like trying to put them back together and get them to work. And here I am, 30 years later trying to do that with, cars.
Full size, real stuff. Yeah,
real stuff. And, it's really fun, and we do really cool stuff. And, it's where I belong, and a lot of the guys in the shop belong. This is our passion.
And by the way, how did you get into this in the first place, Forrest? I always love talking to young guys who are getting into this business because there are so many great jobs in auto restoration,
Definitely.
Preservation. And, we've got places like McPherson College that's training the next generation. But what's your story?
Oh, man. Yeah. So I can give you like the maybe semi-abbreviated version. It's a long story, but so I've been with the GRIOT'S organizations for 16 years. I'm 35. I started when I was 19 in the retail store of our old headquarters building in Washington, Fife, Washington. And, I graduated high school. I didn't want to immediately go to school again. I was kind of like burnout on it. So I went and lived in Spain for a year with an exchange family. And I experienced a foreign country and learned a foreign language. And I came back and I was looking for the next thing. That took me to get an associate's degree in business, and then also start working at GRIOT'S Garage selling car care products. I had a friend that worked at GRIOT'S Garage in the retail store, and he roped me into helping him at a weekend Mustang event in Bellevue Community College right outside of Seattle. So I fit in right away, and I could sell, Speed Shine and Best of Show wax with the best of them. And that led me to an opportunity to work in the retail store. I helped build and staff the retail store that's currently at the headquarters building, a huge ex-Coca-Cola bottling facility that's been converted into car care mecca with a auto display showing really cool vintage cars and a huge retail store that customers can learn how to use the car care products on their vehicles and buy all the car care products that GRIOT'S Garage provides.
I got to get up there, by the way. That
you got to
really
check
cool.
it out. And you can come to our shop, which is right next door too. So I did that for like 2 or 3 years. And, I just reached the extent of how much I wanted to work in retail. I was looking for growth. I was looking for, maybe a more solid career path, or what I felt like was a more solid career path for me. And I was working on my own projects at the same time. I've got old motorcycles. I've got old Volkswagen. I was always making stuff. And Richard GRIOT, the owner of GRIOT'S Garage, started to notice. And Griot's Garage was in a transitionary period in their leadership, and Richard Griot offered every employee in his business a 15-minute sit-down meeting to talk about how what was wrong, what could be improved with Griot's Garage moving forward. And I chose not to do that. I chose to go into that meeting not with like improvements for Griot's Garage, but with a portfolio and a resume of work for myself in the attempt to get a job working just for Richard Griot on his personal collection of vehicles.
That was smart.
I don't know. It was really just intuition at that point, you know, like I was just following what I liked. I knew I wanted to be around cars. That happened early on, you know, as a teenager. And it was just kind of out of the ether. I didn't have a whole lot of like family influence in terms of my car passion. You know, a lot of people have a dad or a mom or a grandpa or somebody who was like really into cars. I didn't really have that. I just gravitated toward it naturally. And so, yeah, Richard gave me an opportunity. You know, he saw somebody with a little bit of drive and honesty, and he gave me an opportunity to work for him as a full-time position, and he offered that full-time position to me a few weeks later. And yeah, that was a long time ago. That was probably like 13 years ago. And so I worked directly for Richard Griot in his collection. I was being trained by another employee that Richard had back there at the time. It was a very small team. And we worked on anything from like a 1975 312T Ferrari that was driven by Niki Lauda to a DSL. I restored a Fiat Jolly for Richard's wedding day that he gave to his bride as kind of like a wedding present. And they drove, you know, up to and away from the chapel in the car. A litany of different cars. The car that you see behind me on the wall is what's called the Griot's Garage Detail Wagon. It's a E30 M3 that was converted into a two-door wagon that we built in 2016 for SEMA as a marketing tool. So yeah, I just really dug in there. I loved it. My passion was always like, what's the next thing that I can learn? And it really gravitated into metal fabrication. So I consider myself at the core a fabricator. I can do mechanicals. I've done every job that I oversee in our restoration shop, from painting cars to fabrication to all the mechanical aspects and even some upholstery. But I consider myself a fabricator, and I just focused on building those skills and learning things and learning cars and the whole process and how we could get better at it.
Forrest, did you have formal training in any of this?
I do not. No formal training.
You must be a very intuitive mechanical guy then.
Thank you. I you know, remain very humble, but yes, I am. I can key in pretty well to whatever we're doing. And I find it, you know, like I am a leader by example. I have 8 shop employees, and they all have different problems that they're facing, whether it's our fabricator or our 3 mechanics or the guys in the paint shop. And I find it really useful for me, but also like very purposeful to be able to relate to them and what they're experiencing, and be able to lead them in the most constructive way possible. And I think it's helpful that I have direct experience in all aspects of this process. So yeah, that's what I did. And then for quite a while, it came into a point where, you know, Philip Griot, who you've spoken with, was looking for an opportunity, and he started working with me and Richard. And we started building out a plan for, okay, we can take what we're doing for Richard directly on his collection of vehicles and the caliber that we're trying to attain and provide that to a broader customer base. And that was the conception of GRIOT'S Motors. We spent, you know, a year and a half renovating the current space that we're in and designing it to fit our exacting needs, and taking all the lessons from the previous space and turning them into process and structure for GRIOT'S Motors to operate efficiently. And that was 5 years ago. So it'll be 5 years early next year. We opened in February of 2020, right when COVID was kicking off, which may have been a blessing or a curse. A blessing because we could really get our feet a foothold before the business started really rolling. But yeah, that's kind of the story.
And that time period was not a bad time if you were contemplating a car project. I know a lot of guys who used the pandemic experience to just hunker down and get their projects done. And in fact, I sent some instruments out to a restoration shop here in LA, probably one that you work with, in fact.
Yeah.
And it took 10 months for them to finish them because they were so backlogged.
Yeah.
So from a business standpoint, not a terrible time.
No, honestly, like it worked out for us. We kept working. We had a small team at that point in time, and we had projects to fill spots and to fill people's time. And also it was just like the building of all these processes and how can we improve efficiency and make this as systematic of approach to restoration as possible. And I listened to the podcast that you had Philip on, and one thing that a phrase that I've kind of coined here is, people ask us, like, do you specialize in anything? And my answer is never like, we only do Porsches, or we only do Mercedes, or we only do classic American stuff. My answer is always, we specialize in restoration.
Yeah.
And taking the formulas that we have and you can apply them to any vehicle, the process we have, how we put a car through that process. Sure, everything's different and there's specialty aspects to each project, but the approach allows us to perform any type of project to completion to a very high standard. And we were able to develop that and still use it very consistently in a much expanded perspective now.
You guys were so fortunate to be able to work for Richard and kind of get things dialed in before.
Yeah, for sure.
That's awesome. And Richard is such a terrific guy, by the way. I have to say, what a great dude.
Yeah, he's pretty cool. He was a great boss. Showed me, me and Philip have running jokes, which he's the butt of, in terms of, like, he taught us a lot of what we should do, and I would say the majority of that. He also taught us some lessons what we shouldn't do. Maybe like buying cars late at night on Bring a Trailer.
Right? I know.
Which
he's incorrigible.
But he's been a great mentor, especially from a perspective of, like, not compromising on quality. Yeah, I've worked for, it's weird to think about that, I've worked for these businesses for almost half of my life, and at some point I will be half of my life, but I would only do that working for the right people. And the GRIOT family is have been generous for me, not only in opportunity, but just as good people. So yeah, Richard is definitely the star of that, and he gave me an opportunity, and ultimately I turned that opportunity into a career, which we're always looking for people. I actually just hired, that's a message that I'm always trying to get out, is I just hired a very young kid that, well, he's almost an adult. that's in a local welding program at a technical school, and he wants to be a fabricator, and I gave him an opportunity to prove himself, and we're just starting on that journey. But I'm always looking for people who are passionate about cars, passionate about developing their skills and learning, And I would say like most of the time I hire for attitude over skill level, because we can teach people a lot of different things, but we want positive people. We want optimistic people. We want self-motivated, independent people who can think on their own. That's the type of shop that we're building. And we're always looking for people. So if people are interested, they can always reach out to me.
That's great. You know, there are plenty of master restorers and hot rod builders and customizers out there who started their career sweeping the shop floor in a local garage, you know?
Yep, absolutely.
And can't say enough about kind of being humble, but making your own opportunities and then learning step by step, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's how I learned. You know, I sure that you asked me the question of if I had any formal training, and really like the formal training for what we do is very limited. Sure, there's McPherson College and there's maybe a couple other programs out there, but you know, you can learn a lot being in the right place. I think we're one of those places where we can get somebody with less experience, and the goal is to have a program of apprentices who can work their way up the ladder. And we've started that, and we are continuing to grow that hierarchy of growth for people in our business. But this is for me, I didn't know that this was a career path when I was young. Like, I was discouraged from becoming a mechanic because, and I can't discredit the people who discouraged me, because that industry can beat you down and people get burnt out. But I look for the guys who maybe in that industry are working in a dealership environment, that they come to me and they say, I just wish I could spend a little bit more time making it perfect. Those are gold. Those people are gold to me, because that tells me that they have the dedication to complete what we do here, because we go to that extra level. And if you need to take a little more time to do it, that is not only accepted here, but required.
I have a friend, in fact, who was a service tech at a dealership, and now he restores Land Rovers, and he's got and that's his full-time gig. And yeah, I think that team environment is key to mutual motivation, right? Like,
absolutely. And we want it to be fun. That's one thing that I think is super critical and maybe missed out on in other places, is nobody has to restore a car. I don't have customers that like bring a car to me because they have to do it. Like, nobody is spending an exorbitant amount of money restoring a car just because they have to. They want to do it, and they want it to be fun. And by extension, I want our shop to be fun and what we're doing to be fun, and for it to be a cool and awesome place to work. And that community and that shop environment is really important. Sure, it's work. We are here for a reason. We need to make income personally, and we have goals and timelines and things to reach, but there's no reason that we can't have both. And so we work really hard to create that.
That's awesome. Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit.
Please do.
What is one car that you hated restoring and maybe vowed never to do again?
That's a good question. I don't have a car that I wouldn't restore again.
That's a good business.
I don't. And I'm also not afraid of taking on any projects. Some cars are really complicated. Notorious one is like a 300 SL Gullwing. Very difficult, minimum hour count to finish a car like that. Complicated, difficult to find parts, blah, blah, blah. I would love to do one. There will be a learning curve, but I would love to do one. the car that stands, honestly, like it's never, maybe it's like managing customer expectations with a car that they brought to us that would never meet those expectations.
Can I venture a guess?
Go for it.
The Porsche 928.
Oh man. No, I like the 928s.
Really?
I drove a 928 from Chicago back to Washington actually. So I'm not too far away from that. The one that's coming to mind, and you can hear the hesitation in my voice, but it's a Volvo P1800.
Oh, I would never have guessed that.
And I can't blame the car in this instance. I think just the one that we worked on was just and to our own credit, we advocated for this customer to go get a different one. Like this is not a good starting point. But we were also at a phase of our business that we weren't really like, if the customer really wanted to do it, we weren't going to be like, no, which we might do that now. Like, this is not going to be representative of the work that we want to put out into the world. But at this earlier stage, we couldn't say necessarily no. Like we can make this car better, but it's never going to be the car that you want it to be. And
was it just hammered?
It was hammered. Like this car had been T-boned at some point in time. And then somebody who didn't know what they were doing with a welder just tried to zap it all back together. And we inspected it. We informed the customer, like we did everything in our due diligence, but he had a special relationship with this car, a very special relationship. He had named it after a deceased pet. And
wow.
it's a wild one. It's not the car. It was more just that specific experience. And that would maybe put a little bit bad taste in my mouth. We made the car better. But unfortunately, it was just not the ideal scenario. So every time I see a P1800, I'm just like, maybe something else.
Little PTSD.
Yeah, for sure.
That's a good point though. You want to start with as good as an example as you can. Absolutely.
I want honestly to be, and I will offend people sometimes because I want to start with like the best one possible. And a lot of people might be like, why are you restoring that car? It's already perfect. And I'm just like, yeah, well, it's perfect. It has every part on it. Like I don't have to go find stuff that you're not going to be able to find. It doesn't have any rust, so I don't have to put the car through like multi-week fabrication of fixing rust, which nobody really enjoys doing. So yeah, absolutely start with the best car. You will always save money for the customer as well. Like you'll save so much money for the customer. Yeah. So yeah, we advocate for that always with the customer. If it's Shelby Cobra, original 64.5, 289 Cobra, there's not exactly another one that you're going to be able to go get. So that limits your opportunity. But, if it's I had a customer with a 560 SL come in here at one point in time. And they wanted some restoration work on a car. This was earlier in our business, but they wanted a restoration work on a car that they had purchased sight unseen on eBay. And I got it up on the lift, and my heart sunk because I knew at that point I was going to have to go deliver a difficult message to this customer that they're better off starting with a better car. Right. But in my experience, that honesty and transparency with that customer, instead of like saying, yeah, we can get it and sure, we can complete this job for you. That honesty always comes back, and they are very appreciative of your transparency and telling them the honest truth about you're better off going with a better car. And this specific instance was able to actually send the car back to the person she bought it from and get a refund and go spend that on a much nicer car that didn't need restoration work. But I can guarantee you, if somebody asked that person about GRIOT'S motors and at how we operate, they're going to have positive things to say. And that's,
definitely.
That's worth it to me.
Now, what about working on a really original car? Because I imagine once in a while you have a smaller job. I mean, isn't it a pleasure to be around a really well preserved?
It is so cool. Yeah. So we have, Richard Griot has a large collection of cars. We store some of his cars for him. And then he also has his area at Griot's garage, a personal area for him. And he has some very well preserved vehicles. Some Ferraris that meet that classification. We have a 330 GTC Ferrari that was shown at the Paris Motor Show. It's like one of one. It's a really unique color scheme with like this light mint metallic green with a red interior, and also a 250 GT Lusso that has the original interior in it. And you get in those cars and like it smells like it's supposed to smell,
Yes.
There's just something different about it.
I have to tell you, 3 days ago, I was sitting in an all original 1968 Porsche 911 S.
Cool. Early car.
Yes.
Yep.
And the smell is what I love because they used the Gumihar cushions in those cars at the time. So Gumihar was foam rubber with horsehair impregnated, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And the adhesives, the glues and the Gumihar, they all have that really distinctive, slightly sweet smell. You know what I'm talking about?
I do know what you're talking about. Yep.
Early BMWs have a slight, this is going to be a super weird comparison, a slight strawberry smell.
Okay, sure.
Right? Yeah. At least to my nose. There is nothing like that. You cannot replicate that.
No, definitely not. It separates it. It just it's like an authentic experience, and it's good to, as a restorer or a person that takes cars from bad condition to perfect condition, it's good to experience those types of vehicles too.
Sure, because then you have a benchmark for yourself.
Yeah, and it provides you insight. It's just insight. This is how it was done. This is how it should be. And like those preservation cars they're so valuable. Let's say if you're restoring the same car, for those to exist out there, because we'll go to some, like, let's say I'm working on an F40. Like one of my number one goals is like go find another F40 so I can do a back-to-back comparison, because you can just get so much insight, especially with a car that's been unrestored. And it's even more pronounced when the car is older, an old 68 911S. So yeah, like I do like preservation cars. There's a part of my personality that wants everything to be perfect. That's just in my nature. But we have cars that we just keep roadworthy as well, and reliably roadworthy. So, it just takes a different mindset, and the goal is different, to retain the essence of the car as opposed to like the perfection of it coming off the showroom floor.
Definitely. They're only original ones.
Exactly.
I asked you about kind of a horror story.
Sure.
But let's talk about a love story now. What is the car you just really enjoyed? It didn't have to be easy necessarily. It could have been a challenge, but one that really stands out as one of your favorites.
Yeah. I mean, the car I always go back to is the 1975 Ferrari 312T that we restored for Richard Griot before Griot's Motors was really a business. It was the first time that I had ever put my hands on like something with so much historic significance. It's not just a car or like a physical object at that point. It's something that was driven by like a hero for a lot of people, and had a lot of, the car was chassis 022. It won the 1975 French Grand Prix and did well for Nicky at quite a few other races, drove by Clay Regazzoni at one point. It was so different from any other car that I had touched too, like handmade and fiberglass pieces and magnesium castings from Ferrari, which were just like insane for the time. And the first time I had ever, touched a titanium fastener, because the people who made the brakes for these cars were Lockheed Martin, and they were integrating, next level exotic materials at a very early stage. So that car went to Pebble Beach and came, I believe, second in class. And I was able to go on that adventure with Richard as well. It eventually was sold at a Gooding auction at Pebble Beach. It's now available again, I think, coming out of Bernie Ecclestone's collection.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah, Tom Hartley Jr. got the concession on that.
Yeah, he did. That's Tom Hartley has done very well for himself, and we're aspiring to be on that level at some point in time, and with our sales department. But yeah, I watched a video with Tom Hartley interviewing Burry and talking about the car, and I just saw the car again in that video, and I was like, man, I miss that car.
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable. And of course, the Ecclestone collection I think that's regarded as the finest racing car collection in the world.
It's insane. And, he owned Brabham too. So he's got the most extensive Brabham Formula One collection in existence. And
yeah, it's bananas. I did a little interview with Tom Hartley Jr. at Pebble Beach last summer because he was showing a 250 GTO in an amazing dark blue.
Cool. Very cool.
And so the owner was there with Tom, and what was really fascinating to me was to watch Tom interact with the judges at Pebble Beach.
Yeah.
And the chief judge of that class was Patrick Otis.
Okay, sure.
So, and he's a, renowned Ferrari restoration specialist in Berkeley, California.
Yeah, I'm familiar with him and his shop.
Yeah. So Tom is an interesting guy, a very successful guy. So that's a really good bar to set for yourselves.
Yeah. And, we're always aspiring to do that level of project again. I think the reason why it's so significant for me too is just that it was a cementing time in my life in terms of telling me this is the right thing for you to be doing. And it feels really good once you fall into, I felt not everybody achieves a career path that they love or that they're meant to be doing. I consider myself very fortunate that I kind of fell into it when I was working on that car. And I keep looking up I have a picture of it on my wall. That's when my eyes are wandering. Working on that car really cemented in my own head that what I was doing was the right thing for me. And not only is it a special car, but it reminds me of that when I think about working on that car.
That's great. Okay, Forrest, what is a car that is kind of a holy grail, a project that hasn't come to you yet, but someday you want to take on?
Oh man, that's hard. That car was an F40. It was an F40 because we are now working on our second F40. So, that just goes to say, I never knew that would happen to us, which is so cool. And it just shows that as a group, we can accomplish a lot and build trust with people that they would feel the confidence to bring us cars like that on that caliber. That was one of my poster cars. I mentioned it earlier, I would love to do a 300 SL going. I've researched those cars a lot. I love the trellis frame and the body wrapped around it and the big 6 motor and the aesthetic. My girlfriend loves those cars. It's her favorite car. I don't know. There's just something alluring about a challenge too that I want to be a part of. So that would be an example of a car that I would want to do. And outside of that, I'd love to do another F1 car, another 70s F1 car, or even 80s, whatever, at some point in our career. We've talked about, expanding into motorsports at some point in the trajectory of GRIOT'S Motors.
I think that's a great idea. I mean, it used to be that old racing cars were kind of cast aside, and now they're one of the hardest And now they're one of the hottest market segments in collector cars. So it
absolutely
makes good sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the Griots have a great relationship with some of the most talented people when it comes to vintage race cars. We don't want to compromise that relationship, but at some point I would love to touch some of those cars too. So we'll see where it goes.
Do you find that restoring like a Formula One car, is the process really any different? I mean, because a lot of these components are sort of one of one, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it is different in that it's harder to get stuff. And there's a lot more in terms of like, you have to make things,
Right.
especially. And there's also a whole different consideration if the car is going to be used in a vintage racing series, because a lot of the times they have to have tech inspections, and, like your upright from the 70s made out of magnesium might be corroded or has cracks in it that you find when, you magnaflux it, or the front suspension arms need to be made within this time period, and the seat belts, they have to be changed every few years. So it is different in terms of like taking the parts and processing them. It's a very similar process.
That's a really good point, by the way, about the magnesium, because there's a process called hydrogen embrittlement that happens with magnesium. It's just a normal chemical reaction, right?
Yeah, and totally. And it's even worse because a lot of the times there's a debate sometimes on these vintage race cars that have magnesium castings as part of the engine, and the Niki Lauda car was definitely a victim of corrosion and magnesium. There's like a debate, like, should you keep coolant in it, or should you take the coolant out all the time? Or, most of the time it's just water, because you can't have coolant on the racetrack anyway, because if it comes out, it makes the track a slippery mess. Do you put additives in it? Blah, blah, blah. The Lauda car had significant corrosion in the front timing cover and the oil, the magnesium oil pan, which coolant actually also ran through. And, you got to call up Ferrari and be like, hey, you have one of these? And
who is this?
Yeah, they're like, that is for our car, not for yours.
Right.
But, so it's a different set of challenges and a different set of requirements in terms of like what's going to happen with the car afterwards. But there's a lot of crossover for sure.
Yeah. And by the way, you're a big F1 fan, aren't you?
I'm an F1 nut for sure.
Yeah,
I watch every race. I watch every qualifying. I watch every driver interview. I'm like pretty obsessed. And I also, I get started with my passion for cars, F1 cars in the 70s.
Yeah. Are you one of these guys that's getting up at 3:00 in the morning to watch the race?
I have since, I was before the new F1 TV app came out, where I can just watch it when I wake up. So like if there's a race in, what's the worst one? I think Saudi Arabia is pretty bad, where you have to get up at 3 or 4 in the morning. I used to actually get up on the Sunday and watch those races, but now I can, I just have to stay off social media and YouTube, but I can't do any of that because I don't want the result. There's so many spoilers out there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do watch every race, but I'm not as hardcore as like getting up in the middle of the night anymore. Maybe it's because I'm getting older.
So who's your guy then?
Ooh, I'm a Lando Norris fan currently,
Interesting.
I have to say that I am. I really just like competitive racing. So I want to see a season like this season was pretty awesome because you had, 4 different manufacturers mixing it up for the titles between Ferrari, Mercedes, McLaren, and Red Bull. But I'm also a McLaren fan. Like I've touched quite a few McLaren cars from M23 that was driven by Jochen Moss to Richard Griot actually owns Bruce McLaren's 1967 M6A. That was the first car that Bruce took to the Can-Am Championship, won the championship in 1967.
Is that car? That's the metallic blue car, right?
It's actually Papaya, or
it is Papaya. Okay,
or what used to be Papaya.
Right.
The colors changed slightly since the 60s, but
yes,
it's a 1967 championship winning car. So that's around. So I love McLaren. I think the stuff that McLaren has done in their history is really cool.
By the way, did Richard bring that car to Velocity Invitational? Not this year, but last year, I think, because they had the big McLaren celebration.
I'm trying to remember if he may have. I don't remember. I know they didn't go this year, but he's got a relationship with Zach Brown, and
cool.
They're both vintage racing enthusiasts. So yeah, I love McLaren. I think they do cool stuff. I like Lando as a humble, self-critical, technical driver, and it's cool to see him, progressing and becoming better, and like taking some challenge to Max. So yeah, I love watching though. It's really fun. It's my sport.
No, that's great. And have you been to many races?
I haven't. I'm the obsessed guy that has never been to a race. I'd love to go to Austin.
I was going to say, go to COTA. It's a great circuit. There's not a bad seat in the house.
Yeah, for sure. It's probably in the cards for next year. I'd also like to go to like the Jacques Villeneuve in France, like the French Grand Prix. My mom loves France, so maybe I can. She also wants to go to F1 race too, which is kind of cool. But
there you go.
A little south of France vacation and then go to F1 race sounds pretty cool.
Oh, that'd be amazing. Get a group of people together and rent a house in the area.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So it's on the bucket list. So much of my focus has been here, and when I'm not here, not doing car stuff, to have a little work-life balance, but it's definitely on the list.
Something interesting about current F1 is that the driver longevity, I think, is kind of unprecedented in a way.
For sure.
There's very little turnover in F1 overall.
Yeah, I mean, you still have Fernando Alonso like competing in the top 5 in some races, which is incredible. And then, I think Lewis is my age or maybe a little bit older than I am.
I think Lewis is pushing 37.
Yeah, so a little bit older than me, but yeah, it's pretty incredible, And then the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got guys like Liam Lawson and Yuki Tsunoda who are like 20 or under or slightly over, and that are like, earning their right to be there. Yeah, it's fun to watch. Franco Colapinto, like they're, and then you see people struggling too. Yeah, like Sergio Perez has had a difficult year. And then, also like Valtteri Bottas, Hülkenberg, Magnussen, these guys who don't have a drive for next year. It's hard to say aging out because these are really talented race car drivers.
Well, I mean, the elephant in the room is that F1 is so safe now. I mean, it used to be that the driver attrition was because they got killed.
Oh man, it was nuts. Like the year after the car of the Niki Laudas that I worked on, 76, he had that insane crash that burned half his body at the Nürburgring. So yeah, I mean, you still have times when like Roman Grosjean goes through a guardrail and lights on fire.
That was spectacular.
Yeah, or like
not in a good way.
I know it was incredible. And then like Zhao Guanyu, who like flipped over in the Silverstone Grand Prix, which was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. So
that crash is the most outlandish racing crash captured on video ever. Yeah, video or film.
Well, you just don't expect one of these cars to flip, like because they very rarely flip over anymore. And in that instance, his wheels just dug into the gravel and it flipped over, and then the car was upside down, and like, yeah, it just doesn't happen very often anymore. Whereas like back in the 80s, the whole nose of the car could be ripped off and your legs are hanging out of the cockpit.
Yeah.
So it's changed a lot for the better, for sure. I think at the end of the day, people just want to see like competitive racing and people passing people. Sure, it's got to be close and people are going to go over the line and stuff like that. But yeah, it's exciting to watch.
That's kind of my the one thing that bothers me is there's just not that much overtaking in this era.
Yeah.
And it's kind of tough I'll be honest. I enjoy F1, but it's kind of like watching baseball sometimes.
Sure. Yeah. Especially in the middle of the race, like.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. The beginning's usually really exciting. And then there's, tire differentials that can make the end exciting. Yeah. Look, like for me, I'm obsessed, but I'm always like, I'm also like casual. Like I'm usually watching this on a Sunday morning, drinking my coffee, just like hanging out. So not a bad thing to do.
I like the idea that you decompress from the job by watching F1.
Is that real? No, honestly, that probably is decompression, but I get a lot of decompression from doing fabrication projects on my own at home.
Very good.
Yeah. I have a 79 Kawasaki KZ650 motorcycle that was the first project I ever did. And that was with skills from 15 years ago, Forrest. And now the skills have changed drastically, whether it's welding, aluminum fabrication, 3D printing. So I'm taking that same project that I built so long ago and bringing it up to today's level, which is fun. And for me to go down in my own garage and zone out on making something, that's my biggest decompression for sure. And that sounds crazy for probably to some people, but my job has changed a lot in the last few years too. It's become a lot more of management and less of doing the actual hands-on work, which is the nature of my path. But I always find time to do my own stuff too.
Yeah. I mean, I like what you said about you find it rewarding just managing the big picture. It's so important. You're keeping things on track, and I'm sure your customers are grateful for it. Well, I didn't expect to talk about F1, but that was a nice little departure, and I've enjoyed this so much. Forrest Davis from GRIOT'S Motors, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Maurice. It was a pleasure to chat with you, and I hope that we get an opportunity to meet in person at some point.
Absolutely. I want to tour the shop and go next door and see the folks at GRIOT'S Garage. But in terms of the shop, you can find out more at griotsmotors.com, and I'll have links in the show notes. And Forrest, have a great day.
You too, Maurice. Thank you.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. Go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage to support the show. And subscribe to the YouTube channel. I got lots of good stuff over there. The podcast is up there, but also plenty of different videos. Some of the podcast episodes, by the way, are full video productions. My last one with Justin Gurney and Kip Cypress, that's a great one. I think you'll enjoy it, so check that out. And back here in podcast land, join me on Wednesday, January 22nd for more of the people and stories behind the machines. So until then, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.